just wrote a piece that I am single-handed the one who responsible for the pandemic. I apologize because that was exactly my New Year resolution. You know, stay home, eat, watch movies, and sleep a lot. And that's what we've been all doing. So maybe you gotta be careful what you wish for.
Exactly.
We have here the Professor David Schultz, is a political science in the University of. Well, let me share this. In the University of Hamline University. I read your latest article or blog, America and the Rise of the Chinese Century.
Yeah.
And I think you're responding to this guy in 1942. He said, American living, this is the American century. That was like 70 years ago. And we're talking about the new rivalry between China and the United States, and how this pandemic and its impact on our economy and culture and all the challenge that's been facing. And I think eventually you said maybe this is the end of American century and the beginning of another empire, another century for the Chinese. So you see it now?
I see it.
Okay, so here I scroll. Here's a headline: America and the Rise of Chinese Century. And this is, we're talking about global now, not talking about here and open the economy and those nuts with machine guns in the front of the Capitol. We're getting bigger here. So.
Sure. There's a couple of ways of interpreting the piece here, but think about it in the fact that, again, in 1942, Henry Luce, who was basically the founder of Time Magazine, Life Magazine, writes this
I didn't even know that.
Famous article, and basically says we're at the beginning of the American century. And there's been lots of times, over the last, let's say 60, 70, 80 years, that people have thought that the American century was coming to an end. Famously, Khrushchev declares in 1956, Khrushchev being Nikita Khrushchev, the party secretary for the Soviet Union, that Russia's going to bury the United States. There was this belief back in the 80s that Japan was going to overtake the United States, but none of it came true. Berlin Wall falls 89, Soviet Union breaks up 91. This is Francis Fukuyama's argument that says that, guess what? We won, they lost. We being the United States, the communists lost, Russia lost, we're the sole surviving superpower. This is a vindication of a liberal democratic capitalism. And part of what I say is, guess what? Somewhere along the line, someone probably forgot to tell the Chinese that we won and they lost. And what I try to point out in the paper, or in my article here, is a couple of different things. That first, Trump is certainly not doing very much to make America great again, if that's what his aim is. But even if he were, the suggestion is that where the United States is now versus where it was 40, 50, 60 years ago is very, very different. Take us back to a place like, let's say 1960, 1970. The United States' economy is 40% of the world's GDP. I mean, we're just enormous. So not only are we a big superpower militarily, but we're economically. But now take us to the present. We're looking at our percentage of the world GDP being about 16, 17%. China's larger than us. European Union's larger than us. The world looks very different. And so
I saw this. I thought we still economically, maybe we'll talk about different things. I thought we are about 18 trillion, the side of our economy or GDP, and the Chinese probably 14 or 13 trillion. Still smaller, and the European Union are even smaller than the Chinese. But you're talking about the Chinese is bigger than us?
Yes, really? The estimates are now, and again, these are estimates, that their GDP is larger of the United States, or let's say, even if it's not larger, it's close to the United States.
Yeah.
The European Union's close to the United States. And the point being is that again, since the Cold War, uh, up until now, we've never had a situation where the next largest economy in the world was even remotely close to the United States. At one point, I think it was what? At one point, the Soviet Union's economy during the height of the Cold War was only 60% that of the United States. And so we just had an enormous economic advantage in the world. And so now the world economy is not ours only, and such that we can sort of push and dominate people. And that's what I'm sort of wondering here, is that Trump's approach to dealing with China in terms of what? Blaming them for the pandemic, in terms of the boycotts, in terms of the embargoes and so forth. None of these are strategies that are going to address what? The global strength that China is amassing now. And by the end of the piece, what I really want to suggest is a couple of different things. One of them is that, like every other hegemon, every other world power, if before us it was Great Britain, if before Great Britain, maybe it was France, I don't know who it was. Their time has come, and maybe we're now seeing the end of the American century, in the sense of either it is the economic situation in the world has so changed that we can't dominate, or with the fact that Donald Trump is taking a series of policies that are certainly shrinking the U.S. influence in the world.
Isn't it that what he wants to do? He wants to withdraw, doesn't want to be the police, the world police, and he doesn't want to play the role. He just want to shrink back and take care of the Americans and let the people, it's like he wants to get us back to before World War I,
Yeah.
The Middle East, Turkey will take that, and Chinese, he wouldn't mind Chinese messing with the East Pacific. Yeah. And but in all seriousness, is there a difference between the Chinese empire and the American empire? It seems like with the global economy, you can't even separate both of us. Chinese becoming the labor forces of the global economy, and the co-dependency on each other. Chinese needed us, I think you alluded to that, and we need them. Yep. And we can't separate, China is very much a capitalist state, and we are. So what differentiate that new empire, that was going to take that new century?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, is that the interdependence of the Chinese and American economies right now is what I really think that the United States should be thinking about for the future, to recognizing the fact that we've got a country with 4 times the population of the United States, that inevitably it's going to become probably economically larger than the United States. In the early 19th century, economists say that China, or whatever it was called China back then, clearly had the largest economy in the world, and it's sort of had a downturn of about 150 years. So it's again going to probably have the largest economy in the world. It's producing enormous amounts of consumer goods that we're heavily dependent upon. People also forget about the fact that Chinese banks buy a lot of U.S. debt. So we're highly interdependent. And maybe the way that the United States, from a foreign policy perspective, should work with China is to foster that interdependence and create a new stability. Instead, what Trump is doing, but the idea of saying everybody goes off on their own, we're going to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, out of the Paris Accords, out of the Iranian nuclear accords, fill in the blank, et cetera, maybe NATO, is that he's shrinking the U.S.'s influence in the world, creating the opportunity for another country like China to expand its influence. And part of what Luce meant when he talked about the coming American century back in 1942 was how the United States was creating world institutions that favored its way of life. The UN, the World Trade Organization, GATT, all these are These are American institutions that favor America's version of capitalism. And if it starts to retreat from these, it's going to allow other countries to create the type of global institutions that favor them. So think about it here. It's not a question if globalization is going to occur. It's happened. It's going to occur. The question is, what are the rules of globalization and who are the winners and losers? And Trump's approach to foreign policy, to international relations, seems to make it harder for the United States to guarantee that it's going to set the rules of the game.
Could you compare to us what the British were in the 40s and the 50s when they saw the writing on the wall? There is a new players. That their empire is shrinking, and the Americans are the new superpower. The military defeated everybody in Europe, and
right. And how they did it was interesting, because remember, to be a global power, let's say, even as late as 1945, meant colonies. And think about the period from, let's say, approximately 1945 to 1970. It's Britain unloading India. It's unloading a lot of its colonies. We know that, for example, in the continent of Africa, the big decolonialization movement, from France, from Great Britain, and so forth occurred. So for them, I think they decided to become sort of second fiddle to the United States, but in this thing called NATO, perhaps, of which there's still kind of joint security here. But I think there was a recognition of the inevitable shift, but also I would say that partly what made it easier for the Brits to do this is that in more ways than not, Great Britain and the United States share a lot of common values, versus beyond capitalism. I'm not sure what values the United States and China share. I mean, they are rival views in terms of political systems, political economic systems, I should say. We're sort of free market capitalism. There's state capitalism, centrally controlled capitalism. And so I think there's a bigger difference here. Plus now, for us, the unloading of the American century is not about decolonialization. It's probably about withdrawing from international treaties, pulling back from honoring, let's say, NATO commitments, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a parallel here, but there's also, I think, a significant difference in terms of the handoff from Britain to US to China.
Well, I know you need to go, but let's end that with maybe we should look at it not so much the rivalry between the new superpower or the new century for the Chinese and the failure of the American to actually deliver. People themselves are not looking up to the Americans anymore. So regardless of what Trump want to do or the America want to do, people are not looking at them anymore as a leader or to lead them in any aspect of their life.
No, you're right. I was going to say, traditionally, the United States used hard power, you're right, used soft power, but soft power also included what? Diplomatic, economic. And I tell people, people forget. What's the single greatest export of the United States? Culture. I mean, everybody around the world knows what? Nike, Hollywood, McDonald's, Coca-Cola. Remember, the book, one of my former professors, Ben Barber, wrote the book, Jihad versus McWorld. His whole point was that this is kind of like the Huntington Clash of Civilizations argument here. But what the United States has so much been successful at doing is exporting culture and values. And now I think, Trump's not using the diplomatic. Economically, it's not as powerful as it used to be. The militarily, he seems to be, for good or for bad, hesitant to use that. And now you have to wonder, how much does the rest of the world look at American values and say, that's who we want to be? I think what the coronavirus has done is made the world an object of pity. Yeah. People look at us and say, look at how badly screwed up at this point, and they actually feel sorry for us. That's not what made America great, being pitied.
I've been in this country for 4 years, and this is the first time my family in Egypt worrying about me, and things are horrible in Egypt. Things are just horrible, but they're worrying about me in so many different ways. So what is the role of the progressive in this country to take advantage of this. You remember on 9/11, and they talk about the shock and awe, and invade and execute the conservative agenda because this is our chance. Go invade country and kill people and take their oil or whatever. Isn't it the role now? It's open for the progressive wing of this country, if there is one, to take advantage of them. Look at this structure and the failure of capital, free market economy that was not ready and failing us to respond to this pandemic, and the inequality huge, and the poor are dying and the rich are just sitting there. And we found out the most essential people in our economy are the workers, that they've been underpaid and overworked.
Yeah, well, the progressive wing had their opportunity until about March 15th. And I say that because, remember, Bernie Sanders, through about the first week of March, was still the front runner for the Democratic Party. And then Super Tuesday hit, and then we got the pandemic, and that ended it. So that the window that should have been there, because it's absolutely correct. I remember watching that debate one-on-one, Biden versus Sanders, and Biden kept saying, this is just a short-term emergency, don't worry about it. And Sanders saying, no, this is the window for structural reform of the economy, of healthcare, of banking, of a variety of things. The progressives lost their window. The centrists, the conservatives, whatever, are going to say, we'll bail out to the tune of several $1 trillion, the banks, the businesses, the Walmarts. And once all that's okay, we'll go back to the way we were.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We'll leave you there.
All right. See you later. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.